Hello, welcome everyone to this talk, which is the second one in the series for the Friends of Leighton House. And this talk will focus on Sambourne House, the less well-known house, studio house that we manage. But while we wait for people joining, I just wanted to remind you about a couple of things on Zoom etiquette. Basically, we have disabled your microphones and we ask you to keep your cameras off for the duration of the talk. There is a chance to ask questions via the chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. And you feel free to ask the questions while Hannah speaks. We'll pick them up at the end of the talk and try to answer them as best as possible. And also just to note that the talk is being recorded and it will be shared with those members that cannot join live, probably next week. So just now I'm going to introduce Hannah Lund. You probably know her, most of you probably know her already, since she joined the museum in 2018. First to work on a project to rationalise the reserve collection, and she is now our assistant curator and is currently working on creating new displays and interpretation for as part of the Hidden Gems to National Treasure Capital project that is happening at Leighton House. Prior to joining the museum, she studied art history in the University of Edinburgh, completing a research master's in British material culture in 2017. And aside from studio houses, her research interests cover horse-drawn carriages, Wedgwood, and Jacobite material culture. So I'm delighted to hand over now to Hannah, and we look forward to the talk.
So hello, thank you for joining us this evening on this tour of 18 Stafford Terrace, and thank you to Claudia for that introduction. Some of you will be very familiar with the house, I'm sure, and for others this virtual visit may be your first. Either way, hopefully you'll find this tour an interesting exploration of the house and the fascinating family that live there. In a time when we have all found ourselves spending a lot more time at home, thinking about how people from the past inhabited their domestic spaces feels particularly pertinent. Like many of our homes today, 18 Stafford Terrace had to fulfill a myriad of different functions for the Sambourne family. As an illustrator and cartoonist for Punch magazine, Linley Sambourne worked from home, and the house was employed as both a drawing and photography studio. It was also where Linley and his wife Marion raised their two children, Maud and Roy, and entertained their many friends and relatives. Balancing these various demands within the confines of a terraced house, as opposed to the lavish custom-built studio houses available to artists such as Leighton, was undoubtedly a challenge, and one I think many of us can sympathise with at the moment. The pressure on space was further exacerbated by Linley's collecting habits. An inventory of the contents of the house made in 1877 shows that having lived there only 2 years, the house already contained, amongst other things, over 50 vases, 70 chairs, and around 700 framed pictures, the majority of which are still on display in the house in their original locations. Now, you'll be relieved to hear I am not going to regale you with the history of all of these objects in the house. Instead, on this tour, I'll give a brief overview of each room and then focus in on a couple of items in that space and really look at what they tell us about the Sambourne family and the way they lived in 18 Stafford Terrace. As Claudia said, there will also be time at the end for questions. So please do write them in the chat as we go along, and I will try and answer them at the end. But to start, I'm just going to give a very quick introduction to the history of the house itself and the Sambourne family. Stafford Terrace was constructed around 1868 as part of the wider development of the Phillimore estate. Throughout the 19th century, Kensington was transformed from a largely rural area to a fashionable London suburb. The arrival of the tube station in 1868, coupled with the developments around Exhibition Road, and of course the Great Exhibition, made Kensington an increasingly desirable area, and landowners such as the Phillimores took advantage of this. Stafford Terrace was one of several streets created as part of the same development, and it was designed to appeal to respectable professional middle-class families such as the Sambournes. The first occupant of 18 Stafford Terrace was a widow, Mrs. Elizabeth Bentley, but she died in 1873, having lived there just 2 years. And in 1875, the Sambournes moved in. Edward Linley Sambourne was born in 1844. His father was a partner in a fur importing business, but he began his career as an apprentice draftsman for a marine engineering firm based in Greenwich. In 1867, through a fellow apprentice at the firm, Sambourne managed to show some of his drawings to Mark Lemon, who was then editor of Punch magazine. Lemon was obviously impressed with Sambourne's first drawing, and Sambourne's first drawing was published in Punch later that year. Following this success, Sambourne quit his apprenticeship and was appointed a junior cartoonist for Punch in 1871. This appointment, coupled with the death of his aunt, who left him an annuity of £650, meant that by 1874, he was in a position to marry. His wife, Marian Sambourne, was the daughter of Spencer Herapath and Mary Ann Walker. Spencer Herapath was a successful stockbroker, and Marian grew up in relative affluence in a large house on Phillimore Gardens. Marian's parents might have hoped that she would make a better match than an early career cartoonist, but they supported her decision and helped the couple purchase the lease on 18 Stafford Terrace. For Marian, who was close to her parents and used to keeping company with the affluent middle-class families that lived in the area, the house was a good fit. Likewise, for Linley, Stafford Terrace offered distinct advantages, as by the 1870s, Kensington already had something of an artistic reputation, with Val Prinsep, George Frederick Watts, and of course Frederick Leighton living close by. The couple moved into Stafford Terrace in 1875 and were to live there together for the next 35 years, with their 2 children, Roy and Maud, and a changing lineup of domestic staff, which, as you can see from this census record, typically included a cook, housemaid, and nursery maid, and later on a governess. We'll find out more about the people who lived here as we explore the different spaces in the house. So I think at this point, let's go inside. So before the Sambournes moved in 1875, they completely redecorated the house, ordering Morris & Co wallpapers for most of the spaces, including the hallway. The papers here today date from the 1960s, but reflect the original scheme. In general, it was Linley, not Marian, who made decisions regarding the furnishings and fittings, and it's clear he enjoyed bringing his creative touches to the interiors of his home. and transforming it from the typical terraced house to an artist's studio home. The stained glass in the back door, for instance, is said to have been designed by Linley. This may have just involved picking different motifs from a pattern book, as in fact there's a very similar example in the V&A collection. But he was always keen to emphasise that elements of the house were, and I quote, "my own design." The walls of the hallway are hung with souvenir photographs of classical statues. These were probably purchased by Marion and Linley on their honeymoon to Italy in October 1874. The couple visited many of the classic Grand Tour destinations, including Rome and Venice, where Linley produced numerous sketches, including the one on the screen at the moment. By displaying these souvenir photographs in the hallway, the couple was sort of advertising their cultural credentials to visitors to their home. Leading off the hall on the ground floor, there are two main reception rooms, the dining room and the morning room, which is where we'll head next. So initially, Sambourne used this space as his studio. Shortly before they moved in, he had the room extended and the window enlarged for this very purpose. So the space you see beyond the white lines is the space that the Sambournes added. This arrangement lasted around 10 years before he moved his studio upstairs to the drawing room. After this, the morning room became solely Marion's domain, and the aesthetic choices in this space reflect her taste rather than Linley's. The space is much lighter than many of the other rooms in the house, with a predominance of 18th century furniture, such as these wonderful painted Sheraton chairs at the bottom there, which may have come from Marion's family, and the needlework fire screens after Angelica Kaufmann. Marion also chose to retain the Morris & Co wallpaper, which Linley later replaced in many of the other rooms in the house. Marion would have used this space to answer her correspondence, manage the household staff, and entertain callers. Overseeing the household staff would have consumed much of her time, and the cook was a particularly important appointment in a house such as this, which didn't have a housekeeper. And Marion's diaries record some successes and some failures in this area. Many guides were published in this era aimed at assisting wives in the art of looking after their homes. The most famous of these is, of course, Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, but there were many others, including the snappily titled Family Fare, the Young Housewife's Daily Assistant on All Matters Relating to Cookery and Housekeeping, which was purchased for Marion by her mother upon her marriage. This book includes advice on everything from indicative shop prices to how often chimneys should be swept, and even has suggested menus for an entire year's worth of meals. And I've included here today's meal, which would have been a fricandeau, which I think is sliced meat, broiled ham, poached eggs and honey for breakfast. And then for dinner, oyster soup, mutton cutlets, tomato sauce, mashed potatoes, snipes, Cumberland pudding and cheese. And the household staff would have had mutton pudding and potatoes. So unlike the rest of the house, which is mainly decorated with prints and photographs, the morning room is hung with oil paintings, including this small study of a girl by Luke Fildes. The Sambournes were on good terms with many of their artistic neighbours in Kensington, including the Fildes, who built a large studio house on Melbury Road around the same time that the Sambournes moved into 18 Stafford Terrace. Luke Fildes started his career as an illustrator, but by the 1870s, he was a successful painter. The two families regularly socialised during the 1870s and 80s, with Fildes even serving as godfather to the Sambourne son Roy. This portrait of a girl was a gift from Fildes to the Sambournes. Marion recorded the event in her diary as follows. Went to Mrs. Fildes, Luke showed us the lovely picture he has done for us, most beautiful girl's head. Sambourne appears to have returned the favour by taking photographs of the Fildes children. In a tour of the Fildes' house, published in the Strand magazine in 1893, portraits of Fildes' two sons, Val and Paul, by Sambourne are described as hanging in Mrs. Fildes' room. The Fildes, like many of Sambourne's friends, were significantly wealthier than they were. Money was a pretty constant worry for Marion, who worked hard to make sure that the family lived within their means. Linley was decidedly less money conscious, but within the interiors of the house was skilled at creating an illusion of artistic luxury on a tight budget. So for instance, Linley often purchased plates which were chipped and therefore cheaper, and displayed them around the top of the room where their imperfections would be pretty imperceptible. And you can see the blue plate at the bottom there has quite a large chip out of the rim and has been sort of disguised by being placed right in the corner in the shadows. Next, we'll move into the dining room. The Sambournes were a sociable couple and enjoyed entertaining, so the dining room was one of the most important spaces in the house. Linley chose to decorate this space in the fashionable aesthetic style. This included dividing the walls into 3 tiers, and I apologise, it's not super clear to see this on the photo, but the bottom section was painted green, and the central section is decorated in Morris & Co paper, but would have originally probably been a Japanese embossed paper. And the top section above the plate rail would have had a different Japanese embossed paper, which remains there today, which was also carried onto the ceiling. In composing this scheme, Linley was probably guided by books such as Charles Lock Eastlake's Hints on Household Taste, which advised readers that paper hangings should in no case be allowed to cover the whole space of a wall from skirting to ceiling, as the most dreary method of decorating the wall is to cover it all over with an unrelieved pattern of monotonous design. Sambourne certainly couldn't be accused of monotony in his decorating. As well as using multiple different finishes on the same wall, he also covered the space in reproductions of old master paintings and works by his contemporaries. To give just a few examples, at the top there we have Luke Fildes' applicants for admission to a casual ward. On the left is Gainsborough's portrait of Sarah Siddons, and at the bottom is Titian's Madonna of the Cherries. Sambourne often parodied famous artworks in his cartoons for Punch. Therefore, these pictures were not only decorative, they also demonstrated his artistic knowledge to his dinner guests and had a practical function within his artwork. To give an example, Gérôme's painting Phryne before her judges, a print of which hangs on the wall in the dining room, formed the basis for this cartoon of Sambourne's called Unveiling the Budget, which was published in Punch in 1903. Like the wallpaper, the furniture in this room is also in the aesthetic style, including this sideboard, which was one of the most expensive pieces of furniture in the house, costing over £62. In another of his cost-saving measures, Sambourne purchased many items for the house second-hand at house clearance sales, but this piece was bought new. It has ceramic tiles inlaid into the back, and on the cupboard doors, it has carved sunflowers and painted panels. Sunflowers were a popular aesthetic motif, and Sambourne employed them fairly liberally throughout the house, including on hand-painted door panels, which he did himself, and within the stained glass. Both Marion and Linley's diaries show that dining was a hugely important part of their social lives. On Wednesdays, Linley attended the punch dinner, when the subjects for the next issue of the magazine would be agreed. The couple also attended regular dinner parties at friends' homes and hosted their own. On these occasions, the octagonal dining table could be extended to seat up to 12 people. Selecting guests and arranging the seating plan was given much consideration. Linley often jotted down the arrangement in his diary, and afterwards Marion would comment on the success of the party in hers, remarking after one evening, "Dinner not quite a success, and Bernons and Haggards not sympathetic." Plentiful supply of wine, often champagne, and the Victorians in general had a complicated relationship with alcohol, but at a private dinner, good wine was seen as a necessary accompaniment to the meal and a compliment to the guests, and could be respectably drunk by both men and women. The Sambournes also had a decanter box for liqueurs, which was kept in the dining room. As you can see, the contents have been carefully labelled by Linley and include abricotina, old brandy and cherry brandy, which was very popular during the Victorian era. Linley was definitely fond of good food and drink, and often recorded in his diary feeling seedy or bilious the morning after. In order to be able to communicate easily with the staff, there was a bell and speaking tube system, which was installed throughout the house, including the dining room, enabling the Sambournes to easily convey messages to the kitchen while at dinner. At this point, let's leave the dining room behind and go upstairs. Like the dining room and the hallway, the staircase is densely hung with pictures, this time many of them by Linley himself. When Linley started working at Punch, he worked on smaller commissions, including drawings for Punch's pocketbook, which was a sort of spin-off publication from the main magazine. Published annually, it included a diary section and directories of useful information, including a guide to the key members of the royal family and overviews of legislature and banking. Sambourne designed the title pages for each of these sections when he held the position of junior cartoonist at Punch. The ones on the screen were included in the 1874 edition, and Sambourne displayed framed copies of these on the staircase. These early commissions for Punch were drawn directly onto the woodblock. Therefore, Sambourne's drawing was destroyed in the printing process. It was only after 1888, when Punch moved to photographic transfer, that he was able to retain the drawings. Outside of his work for Punch, Sambourne also completed other commissions to supplement his income. One of the most ambitious of these was a design for the Diploma Award for the International Exhibition of Fisheries, held in South Kensington in 1883. Large-scale exhibitions were incredibly popular in the late 19th century. Following the success of the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, cities across the world hosted similar events, attracting international exhibitors in a wide variety of fields, from carriage making to fine art. The International Fisheries Exhibition attracted an extraordinary 2.6 million visitors, with displays including an aquarium and a garden with sea lions, beavers, and seals, as well as more technical exhibits of fishing machinery. An important part of these exhibitions were the prizes available to exhibitors, and recipients would have received a diploma card with Sambourne's design. Sambourne worked hard for 9 months on this elaborate drawing and viewed it as one of his greatest artistic achievements. He had it sent to Paris especially to have it engraved, and later exhibited it at the Royal Academy and the Paris Salon. As the drawing room was on the first floor, most visitors to the house would have ascended the staircase and passed these examples of Sambourne's work. Within the purpose-built studio houses of Sambourne's artistic friends, such as Luke Fildes, the staircase formed a sort of processional route to the studio. And in decorating this space with examples of his own work, Sambourne was echoing this within his own more modest home. Another feature of the staircase is the water garden, which the Sambournes had installed in the window around the time they moved in. Originally, this would have been complete with a working fountain and goldfish and space around it for exotic plants. The houses on Stafford Terrace did not come with gardens, so this was a way of bringing some nature into the house. So we now come to the first floor and the drawing room. This was really the key entertaining space and took up the whole first floor of the house. Originally, it would have been 2 rooms, but they appear to have been knocked through before the Sambournes moved in to create one large space. The drawing room was really the heart of the Sambournes' home. It was where they entertained guests. It was where family celebrations like Christmas took place. And for many years, it was where Linley had his studio. In the 1880s, the Sambournes extended the window of the drawing room in the same way they had done previously in the morning room to create space for Linley's easel. In 1889, he was interviewed for the Pall Mall Gazette in his drawing room studio, and the journalist described the space as follows. The quiet autumn sunlight streamed down upon a Kensington staircase, of which the walls were most exquisitely decorated with his own beautiful drawings. As I passed into the studio drawing room of Mr. Linley Sambourne to be heartily greeted by a short, sturdy, pleasant-faced country squire, clad in riding breeches and redolent of the hunting field. And the same sunlight shone through the exquisitely designed and painted window at the end of the lofty room. My own design, said Mr. Sambourne. There is the rising sun and the birds on the wing, something to make London more cheerful. Take a look around the room. I have some pretty things here you may like to see before we begin business. All the furniture is Louis Say's, genuine every bit of it. The piano, my own design again. I have designed most things here. This was undoubtedly an exaggeration. But it's fair to say that Linley took a huge amount of pride in his home and the way it was furnished, and was skilled at making a great show without a great budget. As I've mentioned already, when the Sambournes first moved in, they decorated in Morris & Co papers. But in most of the spaces, these were later replaced by more luxurious, embossed and gilded Japanese papers. To save money in the drawing room, Sambourne actually papered around the many framed pictures, leaving the original Morris Larkspur paper visible in some places underneath, as you can see from this image here. Having his studio within the drawing room may seem a bit of an incongruous and inconvenient arrangement, but as a cartoonist, Linley wasn't working on great canvases and only had the one relatively small easel, which he always used. He was also of a sociable disposition, so being able to work around the rest of the family was in some ways an advantage. In Marion's diaries, she often notes that she kept Linley company while he worked on his punch drawings. And on more formal occasions, the easel and other artistic paraphernalia could be hidden away behind a curtain. Away from his easel, Sambourne was a keen sportsman. he began most days with a ride through Hyde Park or even further afield to Wimbledon or Richmond. In the window of the drawing room are 2 snuff boxes made from the hooves of horses belonging to Sambourne, including Dolly, who died shortly after him in 1910. Sambourne kept at least 1 horse and a carriage for the majority of the time they lived at Stafford Terrace. This would have been fairly unusual for a middle-class family in London during this period, and the stabling and the groom's salary would have made it a significant expense. In a diary entry in 1891, Marion complained, "No expense spared in stables, carriage worries increase, medicine for horses, harness does not fit," followed by 3 exclamation marks. Sambourne also went on regular shooting trips to Scotland and elsewhere. The development of railways had made the countryside more accessible by the late 19th century. And this was really when country pastimes such as fox hunting and shooting were at the height of their popularity, and they formed a significant part of the Sambourne social life. Evidence of Marion's hobbies and interests can also be seen in the drawing room. The peacock cushion cover on the left was made by her, and she also made lampshades for the house and outfits for the children. Marion was also fond of music, and the Broadwood piano in the drawing room was probably a present to her from Linley. As I mentioned before, the drawing room was a space that was used by the whole of the Sambourne family, including their 2 children, Maud and Roy, born in 1875 and 8 respectively. These shoes on display on the table in the drawing room were probably Maud's, and they reflect the taste in women's fashion at the time. As you can see, they closely resemble the shoes on the left, which were made by the same designer and are now in the Victorian Albert Museum. As a teenager, Maud showed strong artistic promise and even had some drawings of her own published in Punch, but she gave this up upon her marriage to stockbroker Leonard Messel. Also on display in the drawing room is a magic lantern, and this was one of Roy's Christmas presents in 1886. From an inventory of the house made in 1877, it's clear that Maud, then just 2, already had quite a large collection of toys, and clearly this continued to grow over time. Later, Roy wrote an account of this particular Christmas, recording, "With dinner over, we rushed up to the drawing room and found the sheet all ready for the magic lantern display. Different cathedrals which Papa had bought, then some comic pictures, a man in bed swallowing rats at a great rate, a woman whose nose grew to an inordinate length, besides many more which I have almost forgotten." And on that note, we'll head upstairs to Roy's bedroom. While the morning, dining and drawing rooms have all remained remarkably unaltered since Marion and Linley lived there, the rooms on the upper floors have undergone a few more changes. Originally, this room was a spare bedroom and was used by Linley's mother when she came to stay. Marion and the elder Mrs. Sambourne did not always see eye to eye, and you get a sense from her diaries that these often prolonged visits were quite a strain. After her death in 1892, this room became Roy's. While Maud was quite a well-behaved child, Roy seems to have been more difficult to manage, and his schoolmaster rather harshly described him as sly and lacking in moral courage in a letter home to Marion. As a girl, Maud was educated at home by a governess, but Roy was sent to school attending Eton and then Oxford, where he failed to graduate. Despite this, he went on to be a stockbroker and a partner in the firm Pole and Sambourne, later Sambourne and Co. Roy never married and remained living at the family home up until his death in 1946. Despite changing tastes, Roy altered remarkably little in the house, including in his bedroom, where he largely retained the scheme installed by his father in 1899. The Japanese embossed paper used in this room is particularly rich and has kept more of its original colour than many of the other examples in the house. One thing Roy did alter was the pictures. After his father's death in 1910, he chose to decorate the room with his favourite examples of his father's drawings, including many of his illustrations for the Charles Kingsley book, The Water Babies. Linley completed over 100 drawings for the Water Babies between 1880 and 1885, and they are now some of his best-known works. Sambourne took on quite a few projects to illustrate books, but often struggled to fit this work around his work for Punch, resulting in delays and missed deadlines. Roy may have had a particular affection for these drawings, as him and his sister Maud posed for many of the figures. Alongside these drawings, there are also several signed photographs of Roy's favourite actresses. Linley and Marion enjoyed regular trips to the theatre and were friends with many of the leading actors and actresses of the day, such as Henry Irving and Ellen Terry. This interest was passed on to Roy, who held a lifelong fascination with the theatre and became friends with several leading actresses, including Edna May, who you can see on the screen, who became famous in 1898 for her role in The Belle of New York. May married in 1907 and left the stage, but remained friends with Roy up until his death in 1946. So heading next door to the principal bedroom, this was the room that was used by Marion and Linley. In 1887, Linley decided to renovate the house and redecorate many of the spaces. This included the master bedroom, which was recovered in his favourite Japanese paper, and given a further update with the addition of a new fireplace. Originally, the fireplace was marble, but as part of these 1887 renovations, this wooden Queen Anne style fireplace was added. This was undoubtedly inspired by Sambourne's visits to the homes of his artist friends, such as Luke Fildes and Marcus Stone, who lived on Melbury Road and both had Queen Anne style studio houses designed by Richard Norman Shaw. Looking at the fireplace on the left in Marcus Stone's studio and the one in Sambourne's bedroom, there are clear similarities. On the walls of the bedroom are some of Linley's cartoons for Punch's Almanac. The Almanac was an annual publication produced by Punch that came out in time for Christmas. For this special edition, artists were able to produce larger illustrations that would form pullouts in the magazine. This example here was produced by Sambourne for the 1901 Almanac when he was chief cartoonist at the magazine, and shows the figures of Old Father Time and Mr. Punch guiding in the new century, represented by the woman in the centre. So, as I mentioned before, after Linley and Marion's deaths, the house became Roy's home until he died in 1946. After this, it passed to his sister Maud. Maud already at this point had several homes of her own, so had no real need for 18 Stafford Terrace. But like Roy, she held a strong affection for the house and wanted to preserve it and keep it intact, perhaps in the hope it would eventually become a museum. In the meantime, she encouraged her daughter, Anne, Countess of Ross, to use the house when she was in London. Anne made a few changes throughout the house, including the master bedroom, which she refreshed, replacing the Japanese embossed papers on the wall with the Morris & Co paper you see here today, and also installing a new carpet and painting the ceiling white. Overall, though, she continued the family tradition of preserving the house. founding the Victorian Society here in 1958, which ultimately led to it becoming a museum. Moving up to the top floor of the house and Sambourne's studio. This room has played quite a few different roles within the house. Originally, it was the children's night nursery. In fact, the whole of the top floor was reserved for the children and servants. In addition to the night nursery where the children slept, there was also a day nursery where they would have played, had their meals, and later on received their lessons. Very little evidence of this remains, but it's clear from the 1877 inventory that, like all the rooms in the house, it was fairly full. Maud, then only 2 years old, is listed as having a quantity of children's toys, and you can see a couple of them in this photograph of Roy in bed with measles. Once Maud had married and Roy had moved into the bedroom downstairs, the night nursery was no longer required, and Sambourne converted it into his studio. After having had to work in a corner of first the morning room and then the drawing room, finally having his own space must have been quite a relief. And he wrote in his diary on the 24th of February, 1899, "First cartoon in my own snug room." Working for Punch meant working to a fairly strict weekly schedule. Subjects for cartoons would be agreed and assigned at the weekly Punch dinner on a Wednesday evening. Sambourne would then have just 2 days to produce his artworks, and he often struggled with this tight deadline. In the early 1880s, to assist with this process, he began gathering together a bank of images from magazines, postcards, and commissioned photography, which he could use as the basis for his artworks. In 1883, he purchased his first camera, and this would really revolutionize the way in which he produced his cartoons. From this point onwards, on Thursday morning, following the Punch dinner, he would begin planning out his cartoon by taking photographs of the key figures. This often involved dressing up and posing in the backyard. The entire household was roped into the process, with everyone from the coachman, Roy and Maud, and of course Linley himself, who you can see here as the Grim Reaper, taking roles. He also appropriated various furnishings and objects from the house, and if there was nothing suitable, occasionally hired costumes for the purpose. Later that day, he would then develop the images from the glass plate negatives in the bath. Linley had a marble bath with a wooden shelf installed especially for this purpose. These images would then form the basis of the cartoon, with Sambourne tracing the key figures, speeding up the drawing process and resulting in more accurate figures. Sambourne became well known for his photographic technique and spoke about it enthusiastically in interviews at the time, remarking in an 1893 interview, "I do not agree with those artists who condemn the aid of photography altogether. On the contrary, I consider it a very useful and valuable adjunct to art." The glass plate negatives he produced and the other photography and newspaper cuttings he collected were stored in drawers around the walls of his studio in a carefully organised system. By the time he died in 1910, he had amassed an extraordinary 30,000 images, which remain in the museum's archive. Over time, Linley's interest in photography went beyond its practical use as an aid for his Punch cartoons. In 1893, he joined the Camera Club, where he took many nude or semi-draped photographs of young women. With these photographs, there is a sense that the poses are classically inspired, but with others, there is clearly a more overt erotic element. Sambourne also owned various handheld cameras, including this detective camera, which you can just see at the bottom there, which is still on display in the studio. This meant that he could experiment with street photography and took many images of young women and in particular schoolgirls in Kensington. After Sambourne's death in 1910, Roy preserved the room as his father had left it. As you can see from the photograph of the space commissioned by Roy in the 1920s. However, in the 1960s, this space was greatly altered by Anne Countess of Ross, who converted it into a guest bedroom. The room as you see it today is a recreation based on the photograph of the room taken in the 1920s and the scraps of wallpaper found behind furniture during the restoration. So this brings us to the end of our tour. Obviously, there are plenty more stories and objects to discover in the house, but hopefully this has been an enjoyable introduction to the house and collections. At the moment, the museum is actually working on a project to photograph all of the items in the house. Previous projects have focused more on the digitisation of the archive, but this current photography project will mean that we have a much fuller record of all of the objects in the house, including the furniture, which until now has been largely unphotographed. This project was paused before Christmas due to COVID, but I think it's starting up again soon, which will really help us open up the collection going forward. So that just leaves me to say thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat, which you can access by pressing the speech bubble at the bottom of the screen. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah, for that wonderful talk. So as she said, if there are any questions, please just put them in the chat. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes as there are no questions so far. And just a reminder as well that these talks happen monthly, and that the next talk is going to be with Daniel, the senior curator. So we look forward to seeing you all there as well. And I'm just going to read Hannah some of the questions now. Emma Veery asks if you have a favorite object in the house.
Oh, I'm not sure if I have a favorite object. I definitely have a favorite room, which is the morning room. Yeah, I think and I think Marion is a really interesting character. So the fact that that space is was more her space, I think is really, really fascinating. And I love this sort of blend of the Victorian Morris and Co. papers with the 18th century furniture, and also there's lots of items from Japan as well in that room. So yeah, I love that space.
Yeah. And then Roddy asks, where were the stables and coach house?
So I was actually talking to Shirley about that in putting this together. So I think at first, if you know Kensington, you'll know there's lots of different mews sort of all around as you're walking about. And originally he seems to have had stables a bit further away. We don't know the exact location, but then he seems to have got a space in the mews directly behind the house. And actually the sort of speaking tube system was extended, so it went to the coach house, so he could communicate with the coachman more easily.
Maureen asks, what did he do commercially with the nude photography?
As far as I understand it, he didn't use it commercially. I think it was more of a hobby than yeah, something to kind of aid his work for Punch or anything like that.
David Beery asks, how many people can the house hold at one time? Any one time?
In terms of accommodation?
So I'm guessing in terms of when you have an event, how many people would they host? So
the dining room could seat up to 12. and yeah, that was because the dining table could sort of be extended. I think I found a reference the other day in Linley's diary to him sort of trying out different numbers, and I think at one point he says, no, you really can't have that many people. So I think 12 is sort of absolute limit.
Yeah, also with those narrow staircases,
yeah.
difficult to have a big party there. Barbara asks, did he especially buy the props and the clothes that he used for his photographs, or did he only use stuff he could find around in the house? And do we still have some of the props?
So I think it was a combination of the two. So there were some pieces of furniture, and there's references to him taking the curtains out of the morning room, for example, at one point. So there were some objects in the house which were appropriated, I think much to Marian's annoyance, but he also had props that he bought especially. So there are some objects which we still have in the studio. I think there's a sword. I might be wrong about that. But yeah, and there's a bust of Gladstone in the studio which he used in the political cartoons.
So
yeah,
he would sort of store them in his studio, the ones he bought.
Yeah, I think so. But he rented things as well if it was for a particular. For example, there's a photograph which uses a suit of armor. I mean, I can't imagine that he owned a suit of armor, so that was probably hired. Yeah, that's my guess anyway.
And a very interesting question from John. He asks that, do you get a sense that Linley felt he had to prove himself with other artists or with his richer in-laws, as he makes this in reference to a comment to the journalist where he says all the Louisa's furniture is genuine, which really does sound quite offensive.
Yeah, I think potentially, I mean, definitely they were sort of consistently like socializing and associating with people that were more wealthy. And lots of members of Marian's family as well were much wealthier. So I think, yeah, there probably was an element of sort of slight defensiveness there. And yeah, trying to put on a bit of a grander show than perhaps they could really afford.
And then David Webber asks, was there a connection with Phil May of the studios of the Holland Park Circle? He was also a contemporary Punch cartoonist. Do you know the studios that are in Holland Park Road?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know they were contemporaries at Punch, but I don't know to what extent they were friends outside of that, I'm afraid. It's a good point though. But yeah, I don't know that.
And I think it's a bit connected, and you mentioned a couple of things during the talk. Maureen, I think this should be the last question, asks about the near neighbours and who were they and did they socialise with them? You mentioned Luke Files and some of the other Holland Park Circle artists, but were there any other neighbours of the Sambournes that were part of their social circle?
So I'm not sure about actually on Stafford Terrace itself. I know when they moved in, they were the only sort of artistic family. The other houses on the street were very much taken up by sort of professionals, kind of stockbrokers and things like that. So yeah, but I mean, Marian's family home was just around the corner on Phillimore Gardens. So presumably, I mean, they did visit each other a lot, and they had that social circle. And there was also George Henry Borton, who lived nearby, who they were good friends with. But it really seems to be of the sort of Holland Park circle of the neighbouring artists. It was really Luke Files and Marcus Stone. There's lots of references in Marian's diaries to her calling on Laura Stone and Van Files, and particularly early on. Yeah.
Well, great. I think we'll conclude here. And again, thank you very much to everyone who joined and to Hannah for such a great talk.